Every philosopher who ever changed how humanity understood itself was, in their own lifetime, considered difficult to be around. The INFJ understands this personally. There is a specific experience that connects the INFJ to every deep thinker who has ever lived. Across centuries, across cultures, across every context where someone was built to look beneath the surface of things, and could not stop doing it, even when the looking made them unwelcome. The experience is this. You see something clearly that the people around you have agreed not to examine. And the seeing, not the saying, just the seeing, puts a distance between you and the room that no amount of social skill entirely closes. The philosopher feels this. The INFJ feels this. And the reason both of them feel it is the same reason. Here is what connects the INFJ to the philosophical tradition more deeply than most people realize. The great philosophers were not outsiders because they were antisocial or arrogant or constitutionally unable to participate in ordinary life. They were outsiders because their minds operated at a depth that made certain comfortable agreements. Agreements most people make without noticing they made them, genuinely unavailable to them. The INFJ does not choose to see underneath things any more than Socrates chose to follow every question to its logical end. Both are built for it, both pay the same price for it, and both produce, through that specific way of being built, something the world needs and consistently fails to make comfortable. If this channel keeps connecting your interior experience to something larger than just personality type, subscribe. This is what we do here, every single video. Let's get into it. 1. The philosopher's curse. Seeing what others have agreed not to see. Every major philosophical tradition begins with the same act. Someone looks at something everyone around them has agreed is settled, a social arrangement, a moral framework, a claim about how things are and why they are that way, and notices that the agreement is doing more work than the evidence is. That the settled thing is settled, not because it survived examination, but because examination was never applied. And that noticing, that specific, involuntary, deeply uncomfortable noticing, is where philosophy begins and where the outsider experience begins simultaneously. Plato described it in the allegory of the cave. Prisoners chained in a cave, seeing only shadows on the wall, taking the shadows for reality. The philosopher is the one who gets free, turns around, sees the actual fire producing the shadows, and eventually finds their way out into genuine light. The story does not end triumphantly. The philosopher returns to the cave to tell the others what they have seen. And the others, whose eyes have adjusted to the darkness, cannot see what the philosopher is describing. They experience the philosopher's report not as liberation, but as disruption, and they respond accordingly. The INFJ lives this allegory in ordinary life. Not in caves, in offices, in families, in relationships, in any room where a shared agreement about what is real and what matters is operating below the surface of the conversation. The INFJ's depth of processing means they see the agreement. They see what the agreement is covering. They see the assumption underneath the claim, the fear underneath the confidence, the shadow being mistaken for the substance. And they cannot unsee it. The seeing is not choice. It is the automatic output of a nervous system built to process at depth. The outsider experience that follows from this is not produced by arrogance or by an inability to get along with people. It is produced by the specific social cost of being the person in the room who cannot participate in the shared agreement not to look too closely. The agreement exists for a reason. It keeps things comfortable and functional and moving forward. And the person whose mind will not honor it pays the social cost of that refusal every single time. 2. Socrates, Nietzsche, and the INFJ. The same interior architecture across different centuries. The connection between the INFJ mind and the philosophical temperament is not a loose analogy. When you read the descriptions of how Socrates operated, the way he engaged with people through genuine curiosity, the way his questions arrived at the places people were least prepared to examine, the way he was simultaneously the most present and most disruptive person in any conversation. You are reading a description of a specific cognitive and relational style that the INFJ knows from the inside. Socrates was not a system builder. He did not write treatises, he talked to people. He asked them what they actually meant by the things they said with confidence. He followed the question wherever it led, regardless of where it pointed, or who was uncomfortable with the destination. And he did this, not from aggression or from a desire to expose anyone, but from a genuine, deep, apparently unstoppable need to find out what was actually true. The questions were not strategic. They were the natural output of a mind that could not rest in an unexamined claim. Nietzsche operated differently, but from a recognizable interior architecture. The depth of perception that saw through cultural frameworks to the values operating underneath them. The specific loneliness of a mind that ran so far ahead of its context that genuine intellectual companionship was nearly impossible to find. The writing that was not designed for the mass audience, because the mass audience was not the one whose understanding was being reached for. He was writing for the few who would encounter it later, when the context had finally caught up with what he was saying. Both of them were outsiders in their specific contexts, not because they lacked social capacity, but because the depth at which their minds operated was structurally incompatible with the ambient, intellectual environment. The INFJ who reads either of them and feels a specific recognition, not just intellectual agreement, but something closer to, oh, this person knew what this is like from the inside, is not romanticizing the comparison. They are accurately identifying a shared architecture, a mind built for depth in an environment calibrated for surface. 3. Why the deep thinker cannot perform certainty they do not have. One of the most consistent and most socially costly features shared by philosophers and INFJs is the inability to perform confidence they do not genuinely possess. Most social environments reward projected certainty. The person who speaks with authority, who presents a clear and confident position, who does not visibly wrestle with complexity or doubt. This person is typically more socially effective than the person who articulates genuine uncertainty with precision. The performance of certainty is a social tool. Most people use it without thinking about it. It is how you get things done, how you lead rooms, how you establish the credibility that makes people listen to you. The deep thinker cannot do this, not because they lack confidence. The INFJ and the philosopher both have strong, clear positions on things that matter, but because the positions they hold are held at the end of a genuine inquiry that they cannot pretend did not happen. And genuine inquiry produces positions that are qualified, that acknowledge the complexity, that recognize the counter-arguments, that hold the conclusion with a precision that is different from the blunt certainty most social environments prefer. Socrates was famous for saying he knew nothing. This was not false modesty. It was the genuine output of a mind that had followed enough questions, far enough to know that the places where questions run out are places where honest people should be careful about claiming to have arrived. The INFJ who answers a complex question with it depends or there are things on both sides is not being evasive. They are being accurate. They are reporting the genuine state of a mind that has processed the question at sufficient depth to know that the simple answer is not the honest answer. This produces a specific social friction. The room wants a clear answer. The INFJ has a true one, and the true one is more complex than the room wanted. The deep thinker who will not perform the certainty the audience desires ends up being experienced as difficult, not because they have nothing to say, but because what they have to say does not fit the shape the conversation was expecting. 3. The loneliness of running ahead of the conversation. There is a specific loneliness that connects the philosophical temperament and the INFJ experience that almost nothing else in human life quite replicates. It is the loneliness of being inside a conversation that has already ended for you, of holding the conclusion, the place where the inquiry actually leads, while the room is still in the early stages of examining what you reached an hour ago, or a year ago, or a decade ago, of not being able to share where you are, because the people around you are not yet where you need them to be for the sharing to be possible. Nietzsche described this as the philosopher's necessary solitude. not a preference for being alone, but the inevitable consequence of a mind that moves at a pace the available conversation cannot match. He was not romanticizing isolation. He was describing something that was genuinely and painfully true about his own experience. The thinking had gone somewhere. Nobody around him had come that far yet. And the gap between where the thinking had gone and where the conversation was capable of reaching produced a loneliness that social contact did not resolve, because the kind of contact that would have resolved it was not available. The INFJ experiences exactly this. In conversations, in relationships, in professional environments, the processing runs ahead. The conclusion is already there. The implications of the conclusion have already been examined. And the INFJ is left in the uncomfortable position of being somewhere the conversation is not yet, and deciding, in real time, how much of that distance to reveal. Most of the time, the INFJ reveals very little of it. Not out of arrogance, because the experience of revealing it and watching the room not be able to follow is itself a specific kind of lonely. At least in the silence, the gap is private. Shared and unmet is harder than unshared and unresolved. So the INFJ carries the conclusions they have reached into interactions that are working toward those same conclusions at a much slower pace. And they wait. And they do not say everything they could say. And the loneliness of that specific restraint accumulates over years into something very heavy. 5. Why the world needs deep thinkers and consistently makes their lives difficult. There is a paradox at the center of the relationship between deep thinkers and the societies they live in. The deep thinker produces things the society needs. The examination of unquestioned assumptions, the questioning of comfortable arrangements that have stopped serving their stated purpose, the thinking that reaches far enough ahead to see where current trajectories are leading before they arrive. These are genuinely valuable contributions. History confirms this. The thinkers who were most disruptive in their own time are frequently the ones most credited in retrospect for the advances in understanding that their societies eventually built on. And yet every generation makes the same mistake with its deep thinkers. It finds them difficult. It finds their questioning destabilizing. It finds the discomfort they produce in the shared agreement not to exclude things more immediately threatening than the understanding they might produce if given space and time and genuine engagement. Socrates was executed, Spinoza was excommunicated, Bruno was burned. The list goes on at different levels of severity, but with a consistent pattern. The person whose depth of thinking produced discomfort in the institutional arrangements of their time was treated as the problem rather than as the person pointing at the problem. The INFJ experiences a smaller scale version of this pattern in their daily life. Not execution, but the accumulated smaller costs of being the person in the room whose mind will not honor the shared agreement not to look too closely. The professional environment that finds their depth inconvenient. The social circle that experiences their questions as disruption rather than genuine inquiry. The family system that learned early to manage the INFJ's tendency to name what is not being spoken rather than engaging with what they named. The pattern is consistent across scales because the dynamic is consistent. Depth of perception disrupts comfortable agreements. Comfortable agreements resist disruption. The person producing the disruption pays the social cost. What changes between Socrates and the INFJ is only the severity of the consequences, the fundamental dynamic, the specific friction between genuine depth and social comfort is identical. 6. The INFJ's philosophical contribution, what they add to the rooms they are in. The INFJ who understands their connection to the philosophical tradition stops experiencing their depth as a social liability and starts experiencing it as a specific kind of contribution, one that most rooms do not ask for explicitly, but that changes the quality of what is possible in those rooms when it is present. The philosophical contribution the INFJ makes is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about being the person who asks the next question when the room has settled for an answer that does not quite reach the truth. The person who holds the space for complexity when the conversation is trying to resolve into something simpler than the situation warrants. The person who notices the assumption operating underneath the consensus and names it gently, not to disrupt for the sake of disruption, but because the assumption is doing work that nobody acknowledged it was doing, and that acknowledgement changes what conclusions are actually available. In professional contexts, this looks like the person who identifies what the strategy is actually built on before the strategy is deployed, and saves the organization from the specific kind of failure that comes from acting on an assumption nobody examined. In personal contexts, it looks like the friend who asks the question that redirects a conversation from what you are saying to what you are actually trying to work through, and produces clarity the conversation was circling for an hour without reaching. In their own thinking, it looks like the person who does not stop at the first conclusion that is comfortable and defensible but keeps going until they reach something that is actually true, however less comfortable it is. None of this makes the INFJ easy to be around in every context. Some rooms do not want the next question. Some agreements genuinely need to stay unexamined for the interaction to move forward. The INFJ develops enough social intelligence over time to read which rooms want the depth and which need to move forward without it. But in the rooms that can hold it, in the conversations that are genuinely trying to reach something true, the INFJ's philosophical contribution is among the most valuable things they carry. 7. What the INFJ owes the philosophical tradition and what it owes them. There is something the INFJ gains from understanding their connection to the philosophical tradition that goes beyond intellectual context. When the INFJ discovers that the specific interior experience they have been carrying, the depth that makes rooms uncomfortable, the loneliness of running ahead of the conversation, the inability to perform certainty they do not have, the specific outsider quality that follows from seeing what others have agreed not to see. When they discover that this experience has been the experience of some of the most significant minds in human history, something shifts in how they carry it. Not because the difficulty disappears, it does not. The deep thinker in any century still pays the social cost of depth in a world calibrated for surface. But there is a difference between paying a cost that you experience as evidence of your own failure to fit, as something wrong with you that produces the isolation, and paying a cost that you understand as the necessary accompaniment of a specific capacity that has always operated this way in the people who have it. The first is demoralizing. The second is clarifying. The first makes you want to become less. The second makes you want to understand more precisely what you are and how to use it with as much integrity as possible. What the philosophical tradition owes the INFJ is exactly this context. The acknowledgement that what the INFJ experiences is not a modern aberration, not a product of being somehow wrong for the current cultural moment, not a personality type that would be fine if it just adjusted to the available social norms. It is a specific way of being built that has existed in every century and every culture, that has always produced the same interior experience, and that has always contributed something that the world both needed and found difficult. And what the INFJ owes the tradition, owes Socrates and Spinoza and every deep thinker who came before and paid the cost of the seeing, is to keep looking, to keep following the question, to refuse the comfortable stopping point when the honest answer is further along, because that is what the tradition was always for. And the INFJ, whether they know it or not, is part of it. 7 layers of why the INFJ and the philosopher have always shared the same interior experience across every century that produced both. Not because the INFJ is a philosopher in the formal sense, but because the specific way the INFJ mind is built, the depth it cannot stop processing at, the questions it cannot stop following, the agreements it cannot stop noticing, is the same architecture that produced the thinking that changed how humanity understood itself. That is not a small thing to carry. It is also not a comfortable thing to carry, but it is yours, and it always has been. Brainy Quiet Mind. Subscribe. Share this with a deep thinker who has always felt like they belonged somewhere slightly different from where they are. One question for the comments. Which philosopher, writer, or thinker have you encountered whose interior experience felt so close to yours that reading them felt less like learning something and more like being recognized?